Good evening, folks. We are here live and direct on a Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. in my office with the night drawing ever sort of darker. Get up in the morning when it's dark. Now, what's tonight's wonderful feast here? So I've been off air for a while due to a bit of a prolapse disc and sort of workflow. But tonight I've come back here to give us a little short broadcast on transformation from a sole trader to a limited company. The four things I want to cover in this live broadcast are mindset, what goes on between the ears. It's a really important part, by the way, of when you transform from a sole trader into a limited company. We're also going to be talking about communication. What does that mean? What does that exactly mean in terms of to have a successful transformation? We're also going to be talking about forms, or the battle of the forms, and all the documents that you need to be aware of to actually try and minimize the anxiety and stress of making that transformation. And we can't have a show that's there to help you in your navigate your business without mentioning that wonderful word, tax. That's also going to come into the mix. But before we get stuck into that broadcast here, obviously, if you're just hopping on, please bring all your questions. I'll attempt to answer as many questions as I possibly can. But before that, it only seems natural that we have a bit of music just to set the tone and the tone. Welcome back, folks, here. And we've got a wonderful person. It looks like the theme of the show is very timely. I'm just going to share a comment here from Josephine. And look, folks, there's no such thing as, in my experience, of a silly question. I'll go through what the purpose of the show is all about here. Those of you who've been watching before will get some idea. But there's no such thing as a silly question. If you don't come from a finance account background, whatever, even if you do, then please feel free to answer any questions here. I'm just going to share this little comment from Josephine. I'm going to be changing next year. This is timely. Josephine, hopefully you're going to get some real value from this broadcast. Take it away. If you've got questions that crop up as we go through this, please don't stand on ceremony. Fire it away. Now, just to give you a bit of a heads up here, folks, this is not going to be a death by PowerPoint show. So for myself, I've been running my own businesses for about 27 years. I'm an accountant by qualification and experience. I used to live in the world of education. I've also worked in the industry, across public sector, charity sector, worked fortunately overseas and for a variety of different businesses. And here, my fundamental aim is to improve what goes on in there, your sort of money mindset, your approach to businesses, increase your financial understanding and awareness, and obviously help your businesses make more profit, save tax and time. That's a fantastic combo, if nothing else. So let's crack on with the broadcast. Now, the two most common forms in the United Kingdom and also around the world, by the way, is either being an individual, which is colloquially called a sole trader. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have other people working for you, but in legal and accounting terms, you're an individual. You have no formality in terms of business structure. Another most common form is a limited company, which we call a corporation. Overseas in the US, our US cousins call it a corporation. And in the UK alone, by the way, they account for 5.2 million business structures there, believe it or not. 3.2 million, roughly speaking, in 2021 were sole traders. 2 million were live, active limited companies. Now, this session, by the way, today is not about the merits of which one you should choose. They both have their place. That's going to be a topic for another day. It's not about what should influence your choice. You've made that decision. You decide to make that transformation. And the first thing I want to talk about is the mindset shift. Now, if you are a sole trader, what that means is that you as an individual are responsible for anything that goes wrong. All your profits become immediately accountable to our friends in the tax office immediately the moment you generate them. Then what will happen is fundamentally, you spend money out of your bank account. You don't have to have that formality of separation. Fundamentally, it's you one of the same. As soon as you step into a limited company framework, though, there's really something really quite important you need to do from the very outset. That limited company is a separate legal being. And I'm going to talk to you in a few moments about how you go through that creation of how this being comes into place. But in legal terms, it's a separate legal person. What that means is that entity that you create, that you give birth to, can make contracts under its own steam. It is not you in legal or accounting or tax terms. And therefore, what you've got to do at the beginning is to visualize this company that you're going to create or somebody will create on your behalf as something distinct from you as an individual. So if you come to your business because you used to work for another company and never another business, think of that company you create as a separate thing. That's your employer. That's the thing that employs you, engages you to deliver its goods and services. And the reason I ask and emphasize to clients why you should have that visual distinction, because it stops you getting into hot water when it comes to things like taxation, which I'll comment on towards the end of the broadcast. It also gives you a good visual discipline to say, when I'm actually, for example, taking money out of the company, the business for myself, that's my employer paying me for my services. Now, this is not about, what's the best mechanism. That will come up another time. Also, in boundary terms, in boundary settings, setting your own terms and conditions, believe it or not, with your own company, is really good to have that visual mental separation in your mind. So that's really critical thing to do. In reality, you might control that business, but in discipline application going forward, I'd like you to think in terms of, I've got my company, Mahmood Reza Limited, not very original in terms of name, that sits over there. And it's me as the individual who happens to own that company, perhaps. I'm sitting over there, but they're two separate entities, and I'm going to draw a line down the middle to separate them accordingly. And that's what you must do. Now, having said that mindset shift, there's also another aspect of the mindset shift. The vast majority of limited companies that operate, certainly in the UK and overseas in Europe and the US and other places in the world, are what I call SMEs. They're small micro companies. So you might have a few individuals that are running the company, you may have employees, you may have a bunch of freelancers, you have a whole variety of things. But companies have their own separate independent regulations and rules. So when you're a sole trader, there's a very minimal legislation, there's a very minimal regulation that governs how you do things. When you become a company, though, you've got a completely different landscape operating. Now, in the UK, for example, you've got something called the Companies Act 2006. I'm not going to rehash what it is, but effectively what that does, that sets out rules and regulations for what you as an individual can do in your company. You typically will assume the role of a director, brackets a shareholder, perhaps possibly in your company, and there's a different set of rules and regulations. There's rules and regulations that dictate how you can take that money out. There's also, believe it or not, theoretically and in practical terms, a lot more paperwork that in theory should be generated to support the actions that you do with your company. What those rules and regulations I'm going to touch upon in a moment, but you have to bear in mind that the Companies Act, which is the main one in the UK, is there as an act of protection, and it protects a variety of parties. Now, let me just roll back a little bit. One of the main rationales and reasons why people become companies is typically either for taxation reasons. The overall tax that you pay out is likely to be less, subject to a few caveats, than if you were a sole trader. You've got more control over what goes on, and it might also be what's called legal protection. So if you're entering a risky venture, you're taking on staff, if you think things might go a bit wobbly, you want to have that personal protection against your assets, then a legal limited company, even if I can say it, will ring fence and make that protection. Now, what that means also, though, is the law has to step in and say, look, if you want those benefits, if you want all those benefits, then also we've got to be wary of those suppliers who will deal with you, and we've got to protect them as well. And therefore, what that means is we're going to introduce some rules and regulations. Now, in the vast majority of times, for most small, medium-sized companies, even though there's a rule book, which is quite thick, and my first degree was in law, even though there's a major rule book that governs the companies, the vast majority will not be of application to most small companies. However, there are a lot of companies, I should say, that I come across that do things as though it's their own personal bank account. You're just going to be very careful and wary of that. So mindset shift, make that transition. Remember, a different set of rules will operate. In the vast majority of cases, if you've got good support behind you, speak to your accountants, speak to your finance people. You might want to do it on a DIY basis, but make sure you've got that artificial and legal understanding between the two. That's the first key thing to get through. Now, the next thing is communication. Now, communication is to a variety of parties. So if you are employing staff, for example, and it's quite possible to be a sole trader and have employed staff working for you, And what will happen is when you set up your payroll and you operate that, it's usually the individual who's operating it. As soon as you become a limited company, that legal scheme, that payroll scheme ceases to exist, and you've got to set up a new one. You will have suppliers that might provide you goods and services. Now, if you're going to a limited company, you need to tell them that you're making that transformation as well, because they need to set up new systems for themselves. If you've got credit facilities, by the way, from somebody, you'll have those credit facilities as a sole trader. But once you become a limited company, then they might need to reset the clock and actually grant you new credit facilities. You may get the same, you may get less. Because remember, the degree of risk that supplier is facing is going to be far greater than if it was a sole trader. So be aware of that. Now, before we get into any more, for anyone who's coming up onto the broadcast later on, if you've got any comments to share or any questions to ask, add the hashtag replay. I know you're out there, and I can pick those comments up as well. Now, let's carry on with the communication. So we've got to make sure we tell our suppliers, make sure we tell our staff, make sure we tell our freelancers, anyone we deal with, that once we go to our new company, invoices, documentation must also be in that as well. If you've got letterheads, if you're trading as a company, you need to think about changing your letterheads, your invoice templates. It's got to reflect the new company details. So again, a checklist, a plan of attack before you become a company is quite useful to do there as well. Now, obviously, if there's a hangover and you're still dealing with things as though you're a sole trader, that's all fixable. It just comes a little bit messy potentially. So make a checklist of all the stakeholders in your business. So that's suppliers, that's the bank we'll come to in a second, that's your employees, your freelancers, your customers even. Again, make sure they're aware of that transition and make sure it's communicated ideally well in advance. Now, other things you've got to do, which is going to trip into when we talk about forms, and also doubles as part of the communication, there's also going to be some formal communication mechanism going on when it comes to creating the company and the supporting accounts that go with that. Now, if this is sounding very top heavy, folks, by the way, please don't let it be so. What I'm doing is I'm giving you a framework. I'm giving you some links at the end, by the way, so if you want to check it out on any sort of supporting videos and podcasts that I've done, then also sit back, relax with a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, whatever your drink of poison is, and absorb that in. Now, having done the communication, identify who the stakeholders are, identify who interacts with your business, and make sure you communicate clearly with them what's going on. Now, the third facet I want to walk into is what's called the forms. I'm just going to pause for a moment there. That's a great question there. So I'm just going to, Josephine, if you don't mind, I'm going to share your question on the screen. And Josephine says, do you have to set up new contracts and agreements with your clients? That's a great question, Josephine. My personal view would be, yes, you would do. You'd have to make that transition. And when I say have to, the answer is no, you don't. But here's the issue. If you do not actually make those new agreements, then any arrangements and agreements, contractually and otherwise, is between you as the individual and the client. Nothing fundamentally changes. So I personally speaking would be, and it's can be a bit of a ball ache here, would talk to your clients, just saying, I typically advise clients to blame it on their accountant, saying, we're going through a transformation here. It's the time now we're going to become a new company. So we're going to get some formalities in there. So, getting new agreements in place, between the company and your clients would be a good thing. If you've got a contract that's coming to an expiry date, you might want to run that course and renew them accordingly. Because remember, your client, I personally speaking, it does not make a great deal of difference to them in the long run. As long as you're doing the work, as long as things are going on, that's great. They know fundamentally nothing's really going to change, but I would certainly set up new contracts and agreements with the new clients as well. Hopefully that addresses your question there, Josephine. So ideally, yes, but I have known many people to keep the old agreements there, and that can create problems going forward. Let's get rid of that. That's good old Microsoft Office that likes to invade the screen every now and again. Now, let's come to the next thing, what I call the battle of the forms. Now, one thing you must do, once you've made that decision to go become a limited company, there's two really facets. Number one, you've got to draw the line, and you've got to inform our friends at HMRC that you are no longer a self-employed individual. And there are two things that you've got to do here, by the way. Number one, there's a form you've got to complete online to inform HMRC that you no longer are self-employed. I'm going to share the that form with you in a few moments. And then typically you communicate that also through the mechanism of your personal tax return. So let's see if we can dig out the form. If you go on to something like stopping self-employment, I'm just going to share it on the screen. It's quite light touch there. There's nothing top heavy. It's quite possible for you to do the form yourself. There's not a great deal that's required there. So if you look here, what you'll see, typically once you've logged in, and again, if you've got a personal tax account or otherwise you'll access it through there, just go stopping self-employment, informing HMRC. Again, I'll put a link in the show notes at the end. Typically what it says here, what's your contact details, select the boxes accordingly to say you're no longer self-employed, put the dates you've stopped. This bit is quite straightforward. Address details, previous address details. If you've got an agent who acts on your behalf, obviously they can fill it in for you. If you feel comfortable with fulfilling, then you can do it yourself. So the choice is entirely yours. It should typically take you 10-15 minutes to complete that. Once you've done that, make sure you take a copy, which we'll do on the next thing, and submit it to HMRC accordingly. Let's stop sharing the screen. And the other thing you have to do, remember, is on your tax return when you submit it, if you stop being self-employed part way during the tax year, so in the UK, we've got a very peculiar tax year that runs between the 6th of April and the 5th of April for individuals. So if you stop partway during that year, you can have a self-employed section up to the date you stop, and thereafter it will be a completely different landscape there as well. And again, you'll inform on that tax return the dates you see. So 2 mechanisms. Now that's one thing you've got to do. The next thing, you've got to get your company sorted out, haven't you? So normally what I would suggest on formations that we do for our clients, again, we've got a mix of clients. Some will do it themselves, DIY. There's a few things I'm going to forewarn you on that to be very careful. You can contact your accountants to do it for you, do it yourself, or you can actually contact what's called a formation agent. So the choice is there. Think about the time it takes to complete it. If you're comfortable with the procedure, it's relatively light touch, but you can still trip up with some issues at the beginning. So be very, very careful. Now, what you need to do, think about the name for your company. So you may have a particular name that you want. I would suggest think of 2 or 3, check the Companies House register to see if it's available. Secondly, think about your address. So where is it you want that, what's called a registered office? Where do you want your documentation to be sent? For most people, by the way, the home address is normally one they like. If for any reason you don't want your personal address shown, 2 things will happen. Once you decide who the directors are, you've got to inform Companies House that what's called your personal service address is, and then you can decide, you can talk to your accountants, you can talk to a serviced office address, and you can get a registered office, and that's the place where official documentation will be sent. Remember, you still retain ultimate responsibility there, but you need to identify what's called a registered office address. You won't get a load of copious mails coming through, by the way, but you still need somewhere where people can find out where to send correspondence. Now, also, before you make that change, you've got to think about what type of company you actually want. Now, typically a sole trader could be what I call a private business, so any profits they make is for their own benefit, or you could be what's called a not-for-profit organisation. So you may have a philanthropic outlook, you may be a not-for-profit entity that generates funds, takes some remuneration from that, and the rest of it goes towards a particular social objective. So when you form a company, your choice is going to be, am I going to be a private company where the share ownership, I own all the company, if it makes any money, any profits, I'll pay my tax on that accordingly, but I get to keep everything else. Private company, that's perfectly cool. That's one that's owned by shares. Are you thinking, are you going to be the only owner? Are you going to have other parties coming in? So it's quite common, for example, for husbands and wives to either be equal shareholders or whatever proportion you want for tax. I know lots of husbands and wives that says, actually, this is my company, my husband has no involvement, or vice versa. So is it a private company that's got shares in it, or is it a not-for-profit entity? And again, typically there'll be, mostly these days, it's either what's called limited by guarantee or a community interest company, a CIC there as well. So depending on your objectives, depending on your purpose, will dictate the type of company you have. So once you've made your choice of the type of company, once you make a choice of who the directors are, whether you are going to have shareholders if it's privately owned, where the address is, get the company created. Now, once you've done that, it's not a legal requirement now, but I would personally speaking highly recommend it, is getting the bank account opened. Now, you don't actually need to actually legally have a separate bank account for the company, but I would highly recommend that because I think it goes back to our first point. It ring fences, it demarcates that division line between you and the business. Also, when you see that bank account, you know that all relates to your company activities. You haven't got it mixed up with your household spend and all the rest of it. So you can't form a bank account until you get the company created. Again, you've got two choices. You go, if you've got a existing bank relationship, you can apply through them. At the moment, there's still it's getting not as bad as it was a few months ago. You can go back to your traditional high street lender. You can apply online, but there's still a protracted amount of time. It can typically take 2 to 4 weeks to get an account set up. If the advantage, if you've got an existing relationship, if you can call it that with banks these days, is that it might be easier on the identification checks. If you don't, there are lots of online banks that make no preference, but most people nowadays look at things like Starling, Metro, counting up. There are other banks out there, but do your research, check out the banking. I would certainly recommend these days, make sure you've got a bank that is good with digital technology. So again, we're not covering this topic today, but in terms of future topics here, at the heart of your business operation should be a good data capture system. So does it do online banking? What's the situation with overdrafts? So get a bank account opened up and ideally have it just for the company, have it separate. Other forms, when you create a company at Company's House, eventually what will happen, Company's House will send you some numbers, some forms and references here. They'll also send you across, they will inform HMRC, because now what happens is, as a company, you've got to do a set of accounts for the company. Let's call it Mahmood Reza Limited. And also, you have to do a separate tax return for that entity as well. You will need to get a tax reference. That will be automatically given to you, by the way. So Company's House will inform HMRC this company's created. HMRC will then send you some documentation. And then you've got to make a choice. If the company is live, and direct and active, you need to register and inform HMRC that you are an active company now. You've got normally a 3-month window from the date the company is created. Otherwise, you can get a slap on the wrist and maybe potentially a fine and a penalty, which we don't certainly want at the start of our business. Other things you've got to, forms you've got to complete, that pretty much covers the bulk, but not all of them. Now, if you've got agreements in place like contracts, supply agreements, again, it's going through a checklist and making sure that you've ticked those off. So what have we covered? We've covered mindset. For me, that's as important as it is all the mechanics and all the forms. We've talked about the communication, making sure people are informed. We've also talked about the battle of the forms. Now, fantastic question from Josephine. I'm just going to share that question. I think it'll be useful for everybody else. Yeah, great question. So your company is dormant at the moment. At what point does it count as not dormant? Now, the general thrust of this, Josephine, is a company is not classified as dormant when there's some degree of financial activity. So this is not necessarily the director paying for the fees for the company to keep it going. So, for example, when you send out your first invoice, when you start buying items for the business, that counts as financial activity, and the company is no longer dormant. So dormant doesn't mean it doesn't make any profit. It's about financial activity. And certainly, by the way, you can certainly create the bank account before you start opening up the company again. In fact, I would probably recommend to get the bank account sorted before things start being more active. Remember, by the way, folks, as well, that if you start a company and for whatever reason you don't actively use it, there's no financial activity, even though it's dormant, you still have a legal responsibility to file accounts at Company's House. If you don't, you will get a fine. So if you're 1 day late filing your company accounts, you'll be fined £150. If you're late by more than a month, the fines go up, and they go up even more. So you've got a more, shall we say, a heavier punitive regulatory regime in companies than you do have for sole traders. And there's a logic behind that. That logic is there to say to companies, look, if you want that protection, you want that benefit that we're going to afford to you, then you need to have some rules, because we're there to also protect those people and businesses that deal with you. So get your act sorted, make sure you file on time. So even if you're dormant, you still have to file the accounts. Now, what else do we have to think about? Let's think about tax. Now, to a large extent, depending on what sort of business you are, if you have a sole trader business already and you convert that into a limited company, there's a lot of depends. Potentially, not all of the time, tax may arise because effectively what you're doing, you're selling your business, incorporating it into a new company. Now, if it's just you're just a sole trader. When I say just a sole trader, I started my life in my bedroom 27 years ago. And I think I managed to scrape together about 4 figures in my first year. So there's no such thing as just a sole trader. But if you're a sole trader and you convert, there's nobody else, nothing else going on, it's unlikely your business will have much what's called financial value buried into that. It might have some, but if you're transferring to a limited company, there may, and I should say this very loosely, be some what's called goodwill. So there may be some value of you selling your business to your company, and potentially there may be some capital gains tax. Secondly, if you've got any computer equipment, if you've got any assets that you built up as a sole trader, you can, and you should do, transfer that into your new company. You can sell them to the business, by the way. What that will mean is your relationship with the company is now as a director. You sell those to your business and you create what's called a director's loan account. Your company, which is not you, remember, owes you that money for the assets that you've introduced into your business. Again, that sort of formality, that tidying up exercise is something that obviously your financial advisor can advise you on, but make sure you deal with that correctly. If you're a substantial business, sole trader, and you're just likely to make a profit, so if you were to sell that business independently, if it does create any value, then potentially just be aware of the capital gains tax. You can mitigate it, you can avoid it, but that's again a topic for another day. One more thing just to mention on the tax. As soon as you become a company, there are really 2 main tax rates that will apply. So you've got the company itself, Mahmood Reza Limited, anything that it invoices, all the costs, we work out how much profit that company has made, it pays corporation tax on those profits. Tick box, that's out of the way. You as the individual, however, you still are in the tax system. So any monies that you withdraw for your own personal use, whether you take it out as what's called dividends, just give you a little teaser there, whether you take it out as a wage, salary, which is the most common routes, or if you take it out through what's called benefits, then you still have to do a personal tax return and file that accordingly with HMRC. So it doesn't negate the personal tax return, it's just different content goes in there. Okay, folks, so let's wrap up with what we've got. We talked about recalibrate that. We talked about communication with all the different stakeholders who are going to be involved in the relationship with your new company. We've talked about the forms that you've got to complete. And again, these aren't top heavy. Just be aware of what you've got to do. Make sure they get done. You're entering a new world here, by the way. So if you get things wrong, unfortunately, there's a heavier likelihood of a fine regime coming through. But most of these things are avoidable. And lastly, you've got the tax situation to consider as well. So again, I hope you found this useful. Hope you got some value from that. If you've got any follow-up questions, then by all means, please share them across. And I look forward to seeing all you people, wonderful people, next week. And again, thank you for your company tonight on a Wednesday evening. Go back and hope you reflect on this here. Again, any questions, shoot them across. Apart from that, folks, have a fantastic week ahead. And I think it's only fitting that we end with some wunderbar music. So I'm going to take myself out the